instead of 7 now. And there's a question I avoided for most of my life. Not because I didn't hear it, but because I knew what it would demand of me. If you had asked me at 30, I would have laughed. At 50, I would have said, there's still time. At 70, I would have changed the subject. Because some questions don't just ask for answers, they ask for honesty. And honesty costs you everything you've been hiding behind. I want you to imagine something. Not a disaster, not a tragedy, just a quiet room at the end of a long life. No noise, no applause, just you and your thoughts. That's where questions get louder. I used to think danger arrived with sirens, with headlines, with obvious moments you could point to and say, that's when it all went wrong. But that's not how it happens. Real turning points arrive softly, disguised as comfort, as routine, as tomorrow. At 87, time doesn't rush anymore. It circles. It replays moments I didn't just realize were final. Conversations I thought I stood continue. Choices I assumed I could undo. There's a strange cruelty in old age. You finally see the full map of your life. Every wrong turn, every road not taken, but you no longer have the strength to walk it again. And that sips when the question came back. The one I'd buried under work, responsibility, and noise, the one that waited patiently while I built a life around avoiding it. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't just accuse me. It simply asked. And in that moment, I understood something terrifying. If I had asked it earlier, even 5 years earlier, everything might have been different. Most people never hear this question clearly, not because it is hidden, but because answering it would mean admitting the truth about who they've become. I'm telling you this now, because you're closer to that question than you think. And whether you face it, or keep running from it, will decide how your own ending feels when the room finally goes quiet. Because once this question is fully heard, there is no going back to the life you were pretending was safe. For most of my life, everything looked fine. Not perfect, just stable enough to stop asking questions. I had routines, predictable mornings, familiar faces, a sense that tomorrow would resemble today, and that today was acceptable. That's how safety begins. Not as protection, but as repetition. We mistake consistency for security. We think if nothing collapses, nothing is wrong. History is filled with people who believed the same thing, right up until the moment they didn't recognize their own lives anymore. I told myself the same stories everyone tells themselves. This is just how life is. Others have it worse. I had to deal with that later. Later became a hiding place. Psychologists have a name for this. Normalcy bias. The belief that because something has always been this way, it will always remain this way. It's why cities ignore cracks in bridges. Why families ignore quiet resentment. Why people ignore the feeling that something inside them is slowly shrinking. I remember the exact season when comfort replaced curiosity, when ambition softened into maintenance, when dreams stopped evolving and started repeating themselves. Nothing bad happened. That was the problem. When danger doesn't announce itself, we stop scanning the horizon. We stop questioning the path. We stop asking whether the life we're living is the life we chose or the one we settled into. I felt proud of my stability. Proud that I had figured things out. Proud that I no longer struggled the way I once did. What I didn't realize was that I had traded growth for predictability. And predictability is a slow anesthetic. Even history warns us about this. Empires don't fall when people are afraid. They fall when people are comfortable. When warning signs feel inconvenient. When questioning the system feels unnecessary. Looking back, the illusion was flawless. Bills were paid. Days were full. Laughter still existed, just quieter than before. But something essential was missing, and I didn't know how to name it yet. Then came the first signal, so small I almost smiled at it. so subtle, I dismissed it, without a second thought. A moment that should have made me stop, should have made me ask why my chest felt heavy for no reason, why satisfaction felt borrowed instead of earned. I told myself it was nothing, and that lie was the beginning of everything unraveling. The first cracks never announce themselves. They whisper, they slip in quietly. So quietly you mistake them for mood, or age, or fatigue. Mine arrived disguised as impatience. Small things irritated me more than they should have. Conversations felt repetitive. Laughter felt rehearsed. I began to feel older, long before my body agreed. At the time, I blamed the world. I said people had changed, that life had become shallow, that nothing surprised me anymore. But the truth was harder to face. Nothing surprised me because I had stopped letting it. There were moments, tiny ones, that tried to wake me up. A sudden envy when I saw someone take a risk. A quiet ache when I heard someone speak with conviction. A strange sadness at night. Even after a good day, I explained them away. Midlife, stress, that's it's just how it goes. We are very good at rationalizing discomfort when it threatens the structure of our lives. Psychologically, the mind protects identity at all costs. If acknowledging a crack would mean admitting we chose the wrong path, the mind will rewrite reality instead. So I kept going. I stayed busy. Busyness is a powerful sedative. It keeps you from noticing that your inner life is slowly starving. I remember one evening vividly. I was sitting alone, surrounded by things I'd worked years to afford. The room was warm, quiet, safe, and yet something felt profoundly wrong. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was the absence of anticipation. Nothing ahead of me felt alive. That's when the cracks widened. I started avoiding silence. The quiet had begun asking questions I didn't want to answer, so I filled it with noise, with obligation, with distraction. Anything to avoid that feeling. This is where most people turn back. Not because the signs aren't set there, but because following them feels dangerous. Admitting you're drifting means admitting you might need to change. And change threatens everything you've built to feel safe. So instead, we normalize the numbness. We say passion fades. That excitement is for the young. That meaning is something you had once, not something you maintain. We mistake emotional flatness for maturity. But deep down, I knew. Something inside me was eroding, slowly, quietly, not collapsing, just thinning. I became good at playing my role, good at being reliable, good at appearing content. But authenticity requires friction, and I had sanded myself smooth to fit a life that no longer challenged me. The cracks didn't hurt at first. They just felt hollow, like standing on a floor that no longer creaked because it had stopped carrying weight. Then came the moment I couldn't ignore, a conversation that ended too quickly, a mirror that reflected someone I didn't recognize, a realization that the person I had become would have disappointed the younger version of me. That thought lingered longer than the others, and for the first time, I felt something sharper than discomfort. I felt fear, because if I was honest, truly honest, I wasn't just unhappy. I was avoiding a question that had been waiting patiently for decades. And once that realization takes hold, you can still turn back, but the ground beneath you is already starting to shift. Fear doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in through logic. Once I felt it, I didn't just panic. I explained it. I told myself, every life plateaus. That depth is overrated. That responsibility matters more than desire. Denial isn't sat, loud. It's articulate. I doubled down on what I knew. More structure. More obligation. More reasons not to disturb the balance I'd built. From the outside, I looked grounded, respected, dependable. Inside, something was calcifying. This is how people talk themselves out of change. They don't say, I'm afraid. They say it seems impractical. They don't say, I spam, unhappy. They say this is just adulthood. I started defending my life to myself. That serps when I should serps known. When a choice is right, it doesn't need defending. It stands on its own. Around me, others were doing the same thing. Quietly enduring, quietly shrinking, calling it wisdom. Whole societies do this. They sense decay, but call it stability. They notice dissatisfaction, but label it entitlement. Because admitting the structure is wrong means questioning the people who built it. I saw it in faces, in conversations that stayed safely shallow, in jokes that circled the same themes year after year. We weren't yet growing old together. We were standing still together. The tension grew heavier. I felt it in my chest during moments that should have felt meaningful. Celebrations that felt staged. Milestones that landed without impact. Something was clearly wrong, but I still didn't ask the question. Instead, I searched for external fixes, new habits, new distractions, small changes that wouldn't threaten the foundation, rearranging furniture in a collapsing house. And then came the moment that should have broken the illusion. A quiet conversation. Someone younger than me, speaking with urgency, asking what I would do differently if I had the chance. I smiled, gave a safe answer, one I had heard before, even as something inside me screamed. That was the turning point I didn't recognize as one, because deep down, I knew the truth by then. The life I was protecting was the very thing suffocating me. And still, I chose comfort over clarity, stability over truth. Not because I didn't know better, but because admitting it would have required a reckoning I wasn't ready to face. That choice felt harmless at the time, reasonable, justified. But it marked the moment when avoidance stopped being passive and became a decision. And once denial turns into a choice, the path forward narrows faster than anyone expects. There is a moment in every life when time offers a bargain, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet opening, brief, uncomfortable, easy to ignore. That moment came for me later than it should have, and earlier than I realized. By then the signs were no longer subtle. They were everywhere, in the way days blurred together, in how decisions felt pre-made, in the dull realization that I was living on momentum, not intention. I remember the exact window when things could still have changed. I had the health. I had the means. I even had the awareness. That's the cruelest part. People think regret comes from ignorance. It doesn't. It comes from knowing and choosing not to act. The question had fully formed by then, clear, impossible to misunderstand. It asked me to examine my life without excuses, without comparison, without the comforting lies of someday. It demanded an answer that would rearrange everything, and I stood at that edge, calculating loss instead of meaning. I listed what I would risk: reputation, stability, other people, expectations. What I didn't list was myself. I told myself I was being responsible, measured, wise, but wisdom without courage is just fear in formal clothing. So I made the fatal choice. I postponed honesty. I said not now, as if time had ever waited for anyone. That was the point of no return. Not because change became impossible, but because I trained myself to ignore the signal one last time. And habits, once reinforced, harden quickly. After that, the world didn't collapse. Nothing dramatic happened, which is how you know it is truly over. Life simply continued, with less color, less urgency, less truth. I felt it immediately, a subtle closing, like a door locking quietly behind me. The question didn't leave after that. It stayed, but it stopped asking. It just watched. And when a question stops asking, it's just because it already knows the answer. From that moment on, everything I built rested on a compromise I could no longer unsee. And even now, at 87, I can tell you with certainty That single decision didn't ruin my life all at once. It just made sure I would spend the rest of it wondering what might have happened if I had been brave for 10 more minutes. The collapse didn't look like destruction. It looked like quiet endurance. After the door closed, I kept living. That's what makes this part so dangerous. You don't fall apart. You adjust. Days still arrived. Responsibilities still mattered. People still smiled at the version of me I presented, but something essential had gone missing. I noticed it first in my reactions. Bad news didn't shock me. Good news didn't uplift me. Emotion flattened into something neutral, manageable, empty. This is what happens when you betray yourself slowly. There's no explosion, just erosion. I became quieter, even with people who loved me, not withdrawn, just edited. I stopped sharing thoughts that felt too real, too sharp, too revealing. Because once you abandon truth, you must maintain the lie. Confusion followed, not about facts, about feeling. I couldn't tell if I was tired or bored, content or resigned, alive or just functioning. There were nights I sat in complete silence, waiting for something, anything to rise up inside me. Nothing did. This is the consequence no one warns you about. When you ignore the question long enough, your inner voice doesn't shout. It fades. Fear changes shape then. Hister's no longer sharp. It becomes atmospheric, a constant low pressure, a heaviness you carry without noticing, until you try to breathe deeply. I watched others take chances I once considered. Start over. Speak honestly. Choose uncertainty. Instead of envy, I felt distance, like watching life through thick glass. Moments that should have anchored me. Birthdays, losses, milestones, passed through me without leaving marks. I was present, but not participating. This is collapse without chaos. A slow dimming. No alarms, no witnesses. Just the quiet realization that the world is still moving, and you are no longer moving with it. By the time I understood what had happened, there was no single thing to blame. No villain, no disaster. Just a long series of reasonable choices that led to an unreasonable outcome. And the most unsettling part, if someone had asked me then whether anything was wrong, I would have said no. Because collapse doesn't announce itself as collapse. It feels like acceptance. And that illusion is what makes the final realization so devastating. What remains after the collapse isn't set rubble. It's quiet, not the peaceful kind, the kind that echoes. By the time I reached old age, the urgency was gone. Not because things were resolved, but because there was no longer anywhere to run. Time had tightened its grip. I began replaying memories differently. Not the highlights, the intersections. Moments where a single honest answer could have altered everything. Regret, I learned, isn't about what you did wrong. It's about what you didn't do when you still had the capacity to do it. There's a strange clarity that comes when the future shrinks. You stop bargaining, stop pretending. The stories you told yourself fall apart because they no longer serve a purpose. That's when the question returned one last time. Not urgently, not angrily, just present. It didn't ask for change anymore. It asked for acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, I finally saw the full shape of my life. Not as failure, not as success, but as a series of avoided truths. I realized something then that still hurts to say aloud. Most suffering isn't caused by loss. It is caused by self-abandonment. Every time I chose safety over sincerity, I taught myself I wasn't worth the risk. The cost wasn't just immediate, it was cumulative. A slow narrowing of possibility, until the world felt smaller than it should have. I don't look back with anger, just with an aching understanding. I did what I knew how to do, with the courage I had at the time. But knowing that This is to erase what was left unlived. Now, at 87, memory is heavy, not because of pain, but because of awareness. I finally understand what the question was trying to save me from. It wasn't just warning me about failure, or embarrassment, or loss. It was warning me about reaching the end, and realizing I had been a bystander in my own life. That realization settles slowly, like dusk, and once it does, you understand that there is no aftermath more permanent than the life you didn't fully inhabit. Which brings me to the reason I am speaking now. Because what I learned too late is still standing right in front of you. If you've listened this far, to it's because something in you already knows. The question isn't stunned and coming someday. It's already here. It's been hovering in the background of your life, in moments of restlessness, in flashes of envy, in that quiet discomfort. You can still explain away. You don't need a crisis to ask it. You don't need permission. And you don't need to be ready. Because readiness is a lie we tell ourselves to delay courage. The question is simple. That fits what makes it terrifying. It doesn't just ask what you have achieved, or how you sit perceived, or whether others approve. It asks whether the life you are protecting is costing you the life you actually want. Answering it doesn't require blowing everything up, but it does require honesty, without negotiation. And once you answer it truthfully, even once, you will feel the ground shift beneath you. That sip's not danger. That takes alignment. The fear you feel isn't just a warning sign. It's proof you're standing at the edge of something real. I can tell you what to do with your answer. No one can. But I can tell you this. Every year you avoid the question. It doesn't disappear. It waits. And it waits patiently, until the day it no longer asks, and simply measures what test is left. At 87, I don't fear death. I fear the version of myself who knew the truth, and chose comfort anyway. So listen carefully, not to me, but to the quiet tension inside you right now. That sips the question knocking. And if you ignore it long enough, one day you'll sit in a silent room like I did, with nothing left to answer it with, except regret. Because the most haunting realization at the end of a life isn't that time ran out. It's such that you had enough of it, and never asked the one question that could have changed everything.